Welcome back. We're so glad you all have joined us for this Learning Corps call today. It's great to see some familiar names and faces and some new names and faces. For those of you who are newer to Telos, at Telos, we're building a world in which all can flourish by unleashing our power to confront injustice. In Israel-Palestine, that means we're working for a time when America and most countries around the world sustain the mutual flourishing of all Palestinians and Israelis. My name's Sarah. I'm a program coordinator at Telos. I lead our Learning Corps. And the Learning Corps is a community of folks who want to continue diving deeper into knowledge about what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and the US in our ongoing programming, continue growing as peacemakers, and doing it in a community of like-minded individuals who are committed to putting our values into practice and practicing peacemaking, not just thinking about it. Today's a slightly different session. Normally we have a special guest who helps ground our conversation, but I'm sure, like myself and like the rest of the team, you all are being inundated with news and have a lot of thoughts and questions that have come up. So for our conversation today, I wanted to open up some space for us to address those questions, to talk about ones that maybe you have yourselves or that you're getting from people in your networks where, they know you care about these issues, you want to respond, but you're not always sure exactly how or what to say. This is a great space today to dive into some of those so we can all collectively keep learning about how to respond to this moment so we can use our agency to continue advocating. So we're joined by more of my colleagues at Telos than normal. Greg, Dave, Karem, MJ, and Todd are all here. So we'll have a wonderful conversation. I hope you all are eager to engage too. It can get awkward if it's just me talking and then we sit in silence. So most of the time today will be given over to questions, and if someone wants to kick us off, feel free to either unmute yourself or raise your hand and we'll get started.
I just want to ask for an update on Mossab Abu Toha.
Yeah, so the last I saw or heard, for those of you who don't know, Musab Abu Toha is a friend of Greg's and mine, a Telos friend and partner, who's an incredible poet in Gaza, who was detained by the Israeli army in Hamas, or not, sorry, detained by the Israeli army in Gaza earlier today when he and his family were trying to leave. The last we've heard that's been confirmed is that he's been released. I don't know if he's back with his family yet, but he's no longer being questioned, which is an encouraging update, but still incredibly concerning. And Greg, I don't know if you had something you wanted to add. I saw you unmuted.
I don't. I actually just learned from you that he'd been released. I've been so distracted, but he was, I believe, arrested on Saturday, the 18th.
Yeah.
He does have an incredible book, things you may have heard, find hidden in my ear. I would highly suggest picking it up and amplifying his voice. It's a great gift for the holidays, but Mossab is truly one of the most gifted poets alive who happens to come from Gaza. And so he's an alchemist of words, emotions, concepts, deeply ethical, deeply moral, and has been living and enduring just an absolute atrocity with his family. And so sometimes when we can't wrap our heads around numbers, we can wrap them around people. And I think this would be a great time to really sort of like platform him, make his book a bestseller, and read it. And one of many voices, but an important one.
Thanks for asking about him, Lise.
Greg, could you show that title again, please? The things you find hidden in my. Thank you.
Yeah. I was actually just going to post something on social media. I will after this call, encouraging others to tag him and do that, because he used to have when he used to ask people to do that before this all broke out. And I'm not a great social media person, so I just never did, but I think it would be really beautiful for those of us to center as many Palestinian and Israeli voices who are calling for dignity, freedom, security for everyone as possible, because there are a lot of them out there. And those are the voices that are not getting platformed. So that's something we can do. We can platform these voices.
Any other questions or comments you've gotten from folks or thoughts you have that you think it would be helpful to raise in this space for us all to address together?
Sarah, I've got a question, and I don't know if it can be answered easily. Um, but everybody seems to be talking now about the day after, and the day after could be a long time from now. But with the current political structure within Israel, which hasn't seemed to want any Palestinians around, when the situation in Gaza is resolved, however it's resolved, what what do the experts over there think? What do our experts think is going to be the way forward for some sort of lasting peace?
The really hard, important question, Tom, that I know we've all been thinking about too. So I will not be the first to answer that one, but anyone else in the team want to offer some insights? I know none of us can answer it definitively, but what are you thinking about or looking to as we think about this question?
I don't want to take all the air out of the room here, but so just by way of personal background, I used to be an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team from 2004 to 2008. And I worked on Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. I was part of the team that negotiated the day after so-called Gaza disengagement. And so I think I would think of this question in a few ways. One, just sort of the same concerns that applied then are going to apply now, but more profoundly. But two, you hinted at it, Thomas, when you said, well, we don't know what the day after is going to look like. So what is the day after that we're actually working towards? And then three, what can we do? So I want to just take everyone back very briefly to 2004, when Prime Minister Ariel Sharon announced this disengagement from Gaza. Ariel Sharon was known as a hawk, and he said he was going to do something unprecedented, and it was. And that was to remove Israeli settlements and settlers from territory that Palestinians claimed for a future Palestinian state. But he wasn't going to do it through a negotiations process, because Yasser Arafat was the Palestinian president then, and he regarded him as no partner for peace. So he said Israel would do this unilaterally. People were skeptical at the time on the Palestinian side. Many Palestinians said, well, this is never going to happen. And many Israelis were conflicted. It really tore Israeli society apart. Why would you do this unilaterally? Long story short, it did happen. And what happened specifically is that there were 8,000 Israeli settlers living among 1.3 million Palestinians at that time in 2004. Those 8,000 settlers controlled 20% of the land, used 700% more water per person than allotted local Palestinians. There was an extreme inequality there. And there were a number of military bases there, which effectively divided the Gaza Strip up into three separate sections. I am speaking in very theoretical terms. I have to share just a personal insight to that. Going down to Khan Yunis, that you may have heard of in the news recently, was next to Neve Dekalim, which was one of the large settlement blocks. Neve Dekalim was on the Mediterranean coast. And Gaza, by the way, is an incredibly gorgeous place with a rich history, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world. And you would talk to children living in the refugee camp less than a kilometer away from the sea. You could still feel the salty air on your skin. And many of these kids, 8, 9 years old, had never actually been to the sea, because you had these division of these checkpoints there. So this was an extreme situation already, long before the closure of Gaza sort of was put into place. Ariel Sharon in 2005 lived up to his word. It was massive. He moved these settlers out. And what we were looking at is this day after. Now, what the entire international community said was that for Gaza to succeed the day after, Gazans had to have some control over their lives. So they had to be able to control people and goods coming out. There had to be an economy. There had to be some connection to the outside world. And what happened is there was this entity called the Quartet, which was the United States, Russia, the EU, and the United Nations. And they coordinated, I'm giving you all the details since this is our really sort of core group here, but they coordinated a series of agreements over 8 months called the Agreements on Movement and Access, or the Agreement on Movement and Access. It was a series of protocols. Condoleezza Rice even like negotiated this personally, like concluded the negotiations of these over a series of periods, all focused on this day after Gaza disengagement. And those agreements were designed to, one, protect Israeli security, while two, allowing Gaza to be free. Why this is important is when you're looking at this first analysis of the day after, all of those things are still relevant. And what happened is everyone predicted, from President George Bush to Condoleezza Rice to Tony Blair to Foreign Secretary Jack Straw to James Wolfenson, who was the head of the quartet, former head of the World Bank, they all said what could happen in Gaza, which Gaza could be sort of this blossoming territory if it were allowed to really succeed. And in fact, you may not know, but there are these incredible, Nizar Farsakh, who's on with me on the negotiating team, is on board, and he's going to join in a second because he actually negotiated some of these protocols. So Nizar, I'll just going to finish these points, but also what would happen if Gaza was not allowed to succeed. And everyone predicted very clearly that Gaza would descend into humanitarian, political, security crisis if it were sealed. Long story short, that's effectively what happened after the disengagement later. Now, why that's significant twofold is I want to, as bringing it up to today, is this was all predicted. This was predicted almost 2 decades ago in great detail. Nizar and I spent years of our lives talking about what Gaza 2020 would look like if Gaza wasn't allowed a chance to breathe and some connection to the West Bank, the outside world. Gaza has these incredible natural gas resources off its coast, which have not been extracted yet. There's a big story there. So all of this was predicted. And for me, the fact that this is predicted is actually a hopeful point, because if you know what's going to happen, if you stick your hand in the fire and it's going to burn, well, maybe you can do something differently. And we know what's happening now. So the result is going to be there. But what was really happening with Gaza disengagement, and I personally argued at the time, and I believe history has borne it out, is that it was a bit of a shell game, because the same year that Israel moved 8,000 settlers out of Gaza, it moved 12,000 to the West Bank and approved room for 30,000 more. So this was really about getting rid of this diplomatic, military, economic burden of the Gaza Strip in exchange for what some, not all, but some in the Israeli right wanted, which was more land, more water in the West Bank, especially in and around Jerusalem. And so I think that's exactly what we saw happen. Now, your second question about or the second point that I had rather about like this, day after Gaza here, it's not just going to have all those things, but the day after is so complicated, because if we stop today, you've got 50% of all structures in northern Gaza damaged or destroyed. So much of the civilian infrastructure, from hospitals to churches to mosques to from restaurants, like people are not just headed back. The day after, if it stops today, means massive multi-generational harm for all of these millions of civilians, and it means billions of dollars in investment, and it means an urgent and probably multi-year investment to take care of all of these millions of civilians who are traumatized and displaced. The real problem that we have today, though, is that we don't know when the day after is going to be and what that's going to look like. And so we may very well be at the beginning of something that is much longer, as all indicators suggest. That's why our power in this moment is continuing to speak up, to center Israeli and Palestinian voices who are calling for human rights and ceasefire, who are recognizing that we may not know the specific contours of the day after, but we know what a sustainable day after will look like in principle. And that's dignity, security, freedom, equality, justice for all Israelis and all Palestinians. I know it may feel like we're sound and fury screaming into the wind right now and no one's hearing, but we're seeing a lot of people around the world, even our leaders, having to be accountable to these calls for ceasefire, these calls for humanity. And while my fear is that just as Gaza disengagement had more to do with Jerusalem than it does with Gaza, many Israeli leaders made that clear from the disengagement, from Ariel Sharon and his advisors, who said it was formaldehyde on the peace process, all the way up to Netanyahu and his ministers, who said that, Hamas was a strategic asset in Gaza because it allowed for the continued settlement of the West Bank. So I'm very scared about what's going to happen in Jerusalem. But the only way out of this is recognizing that we need to land in a place that finally centers human rights for everyone. That's not a satisfactory answer today, but reframing the debate that this is not being pro-Israel versus pro-Palestine. This is actually being pro-human rights for everyone, whatever, 1 state, 2 states, 6 states. That's an important win, and that's something we can hold our leaders accountable to.
Thanks, Greg. That's super helpful. Nizar, I know you want to jump in, so feel free to unmute and jump in. And if you've stepped away for a moment, Greg, I'm going to ask the follow-up question that Lynn put in the chat.
I was trying to figure out how to unmute, sorry.
Oh, no worries. Go ahead.
Yeah, so first of all, I just want us to be present to the fact that, of course, we're trying to talk about this objectively, but of course it's very laden in emotion, so we need to be compassionate with ourselves that we are not going to be unbiased, and we're not going to be, looking at this objectively, right? That's natural. But our hearts are in the right place. That is, we are feeling the hurt, we are feeling the pain, and we want to do something about it. So the question is, what can we do about it? So I just wanted to follow up on what Greg said, that in fact, the Gaza evacuation was a very interesting and in fact very useful experiment in what the day after would look like. A group of people working on, this is the situation now, and we want to get to an X situation afterwards, right? So it was a good microcosm of what an actual final status peace process might look like and agreement would look like. The Israelis didn't call it negotiation, but for all intents and purposes, it was, because as Greg said, Sharon took a strategic decision to leave Gaza because he made a cost-benefit analysis. It was too costly, and focusing on the West Bank and Jerusalem, as you said, was more important. So making the narrative, and that's what people need to understand, the narrative that we withdrew from Gaza and we still got rockets, as in land for peace does not work, is an actual political goal of the Likud, of the right wing in Israel, right? So the theatrics of leaving Gaza was intentional in cementing the myth that land for peace is not going to work, which was the main goal for the right to undermine the left's philosophy of the peace process. So once they detonated it, and as you said, like putting it in formaldehyde, because it allowed them the political currency of saying we withdrew and we didn't get peace, right? So that's one, that was an actual political goal, and that the problem with the withdrawal was, as Greg said, is that it was unilateral. It was not agreed with the Palestinians on how we're going to manage that. It was very fascinating. All of us were very surprised, and Greg can speak to that, of how during those months we actually had good, sessions of negotiations, but that only happened because there happened to be a convergence of interests, right? Which proves the point. That is, the Israelis and the Americans and the international community all agreed that this withdrawal is very risky. If it's going to succeed, we need to damage control all the negative things that could happen. And number one was economy, right? So there happened to be a convergence of interest and complete American investment in that product. So all of us were very pleasantly surprised to see Wolfenson, the interlocutor, being empowered Condoleezza Rice would get on the phone with some Israeli officer who was not letting some plastic, pipes that are for agriculture to go through. She would actually get on the foreign secretary of this superpower talking to a fucking officer, excuse my English, just to get it done, right? So that was the level of investment. So this goes to show that you can come to an agreement if everybody has the same goal. In this case, the goal was a smooth withdrawal. The second the last Israeli soldier left and moved to the other side of the border, right, there was absolutely no engagement at all on that agreement. What actually transpired is, while just so that people understand why the situation got worse, the crossing, the Kearney crossing used to have anywhere between 300 and 500 trucks a day, and the Israelis would limit those trucks after they withdrew. So the economic situation got worse after the Israeli withdrawal. The first 2 weeks of the withdrawal were very positive, and that's the other thing I wanted to share about this that a lot of people don't know is peace is possible when things on the ground actually change. So the first 2 weeks of the withdrawal, Palestinians actually had control over the Rafah crossing. We had negotiated that. Israelis did not want us to have control over the Rafah crossing. They wanted to close it and move the crossing to where Israel can control it. And we negotiated, thanks to, again, American investment in getting to an agreement, to have control over the Rafah crossing with Israelis being able to view what's happening virtually. And for the first 2 weeks, when average Palestinians were able to cross the border in 15 minutes and get stamped by a Palestinian officer, as opposed to 3 days in order to cross the checkpoint, the percentage of Palestinians who supported a diplomatic solution compared to a military solution went from like 15% to 60%, right? So the point here is that Palestinians are for peace when they can see practical dividends that are credible. So after those 2 weeks, when everybody was so excited that actually we can do something with this diplomacy, we can get results, when there were more closures, when we were speaking with Gazan farmers, and they were telling us, we have the potential of producing 10 trucks, but so long as Kearney only allows 1 truck to cross, I'm going to produce and harvest just one truckload of goods. This is what people don't understand, that when we say open air prison, people don't understand what we're talking about. We're talking about this, that the actual potential in Gaza is completely controlled by the Israeli occupation. So it's not a question of some humanitarian crisis because we were hit by an effing hurricane. It's happening because of actual decisions by actual policymakers that are usurping an actual potential that's there. And there are World Bank reports that say that Palestinians, that if there be a Palestinian state, it actually has the potential of getting being economically sustainable. It's the restrictions of movement that are undermined. That's
Yeah,
the point.
Nazar,
The other thing I wanted to
wait,
say
Nazar,
is,
I'm just going to jump in for a moment because this is such helpful context, but it's also a lot for folks who don't have the 30 years of experience. So one piece that I'm just going to pull out of what both of you and Greg said for those folks who are following what's super interesting but maybe struggling to land somewhere is a couple things I'm hearing. One, that when we see what's the current reality, there were so many other things that could have happened if policies had been different and people had made different decisions, that where we are today isn't inevitable. It wasn't inevitable. It was based on a series of events that happened that we need to pay attention to and understand to see how we got here. But then two, for folks like us on the call who care about where we go after this moving forward, most of us don't have access to negotiations or those high-level offices of power. But what we can do is keep pointing to human rights and advocating for and against conditions on the ground that actively make life harder or make life better, which contributes then to the way people, ordinary folks, are engaging these bigger political questions when it comes time for them. That it's really important for us to put our focus on advocating for human rights, making sure there's freedom of movement, combating settler violence, all of these things that in this community we've been talking about over the past several months, so that we're able to do what we can to ameliorate quality of life, even as we know that high-level political negotiations might not go exactly the way we want. That might still be 10,000 foot, right? But landing concretely in this place of what can we do? We can advocate for the things we know we need to see. And that comes back to being rooted in human rights and freedom, dignity, security for Palestinians and Israelis. I want to bring in, for Greg, the question from Lynn that is coming from a place of when she's talking with family members who I'm going to assume are in Israel. Clarifying question, was Gaza sealed originally, or was it sealed as a result of attacks on Israel from Gaza? If the former, how can she make that point to those who believe otherwise? So kind of how do we tell the story of how Gaza came to be sealed and essentially an open air prison, when folks might have different views on how that started or where that came from?
Sure, I'll give a little background and then maybe a thought on how to actually answer that if you're not me. So, the just first background to remember is that the Gaza Strip is this place that has been continuously inhabited longer than almost any other place in the world. And that's significant to remember its resilience. And it had one of the major libraries in antiquity along with Alexandria. So this was a place of learning. But more recently, 1948, Gaza had one of its big sort of historical moments. So during the creation of the modern state of Israel, 3/4 of Palestine's indigenous population in what became the state of Israel, indigenous Muslim and Christian population, that is, because obviously there's been a Jewish population there since the advent of Judaism more than 3,500 years ago. Fled or were expelled from their homes. And many of these people ended up in Gaza. So today, 80% of Gaza's population are refugees or their descendants. There were some more people who came into Gaza after the 1967 war. And this is significant for part of this story, is because when you ask sort of the closure of Gaza and how this happened, this was an incremental process over many decades and many years that accelerated after the Oslo peace process began in 1993. And so well before the disengagement from Gaza, there was an electrified fence that was built around Gaza, and that was restricting movement in and out of Gaza. And what's interesting is that we've heard a lot about the horrific suicide bombings that were perpetrated against Israel, often against Israeli civilians, often by Hamas. That began in the 90s and mainly in the 2000s with the Second Intifada. The first suicide bomber to ever come from Gaza actually came after that fence was built, not before. So that's an interesting sort of story when you look at sort of this relation between closure and separation and the increase in violent extremism and militancy. To your specific question about what happened with the real sealing off of Gaza, so after disengagement happened in 2005, before Hamas won elections in 2006, and before it took control by ousting the Palestinian Authority in 2007, those are all details I'm going to move past in a second, but just to give you some more background, Lynn, is that we saw incredible increase in the closure of Gaza after Israel pulled its settlements and military base out. So it didn't just, it retained control over all the land borders, including with Egypt at that time. Egypt wasn't involved, sea space, airspace during that time. I remember some statistics. I should look these up again, but if I recall correctly, in the 2 years after disengagement, before Hamas took control, you saw an increase, a failure rate in 40% sixth grade Arabic, 90% mathematics. And this is a place that had very high literacy. So you saw the real sort of extreme sort of level of impact on the local population after the disengagement, after the pullout, when Gaza became much more hermetically sealed. So all of those are lots of like little facts and data points that aren't going to help you necessarily with your family. But I think the larger point here to keep in mind is that this closure was incremental over a period of years. It didn't just happen because of Hamas attacks post-disengagement. And Hamas and Islamic Jihad did fire mortars into Israel after disengagement, which they used as sort of this rallying cry. Look, negotiators, Abbas, they didn't succeed. It was us who forced the Israelis out, and they were trying to consolidate local hold. So that was part of the story, but it wasn't only part of the story. There's a much bigger picture here in which Israeli control over Gaza was consolidated over a number of years, predating Hamas, even, which was founded in 1988. So I think the larger story to tell is, hey, wait a second, there are a lot of bad actors here. Hamas is a bad actor. You see a lot of folks on the progressive left where, in some sense, I probably would once locate myself personally. Being too transparent, I don't know what labels to associate to myself anymore, because it just feels like everywhere just doesn't fit. But many people on the progressive left only view Israel through a settler colonial framework, right? That this is sort of this outpost of the West, which one ignores the historic Jewish presence there, but also leaves us in this weird space where you only see Hamas as this resistance organization resisting, settler colonial power. But Hamas is more than a resistance organization, of course. Hamas also engages in terror. Hamas is also a proxy for regional powers like Iran, which is a proxy for global powers like China and Russia, which makes this a very, very different moment. So there are a lot of bad actors here. But what was very clear from the very beginning is not just Hamas's actions, but this larger drive to consolidate Israeli control over as much of historic Palestine, greater Israel, as possible, and to use the closure and the mess in Gaza as a reason to make that happen. And so you see the statements from Sharon all the way to Netanyahu making very clear that Hamas in control of Gaza and a weakened Palestinian Authority in the West Bank was part of the policy of his government for all of these years. Those statements, you can Google them. And so the reason why I'm saying that when you're thinking about difficult conversations with family going forward into the holidays is to recognize that this is how we got here, not how we get out. The way that we get out is finally centering fundamental human rights. That may feel particularly difficult in this fraught moment, and it is. I don't mean to deny that, but there's no other answer to this. It's foolhardy to think that somehow you're going to get rid of all of the Jewish people in Israel or all Palestinians, or if you succeed in getting millions of Palestinians into, out of Gaza Strip, out of Jerusalem, out of the West Bank, it's not going to destroy the Palestinian people or their connection to the land. So I think that's really critical to understand, is that the ways that we see Israel behaving now, the ways that we see the international community sort of sitting back on the sidelines, who enabled the current leadership in Israel and Palestine, the ways that we see the Palestinian leadership failing, the ways that we see Hamas acting, all of these things are contributing to taking us into an even darker place. The only way out of this is going to get us to a place where fundamental human rights can be respected. That's true security. And I don't know the path to that from today, but I do know the next step. That next step is ceasefire.
Lynn, thanks, Greg. First of all, thanks. That's really helpful. Again, big picture context, a lot of history. Is that answering your question, Lynn, or do you have anything that you want to follow up with? Right, that's a lot to try and hit people with when they come at you with the yeah buts or the and ors. Anything you want to follow up with, or is that a helpful answer for you in this moment?
It's really helpful. I need to go back and listen to the recording again and process the information, but it is very helpful, and I appreciate it. This has been a sticking point between, frankly, me and my husband for quite a while, and now obviously it's risen to the surface again. So I will process and move forward. But thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Nizar, before I go back to you, Madeline had asked if there's a place where folks can access the records of these events and the negotiations to peruse on your own time, or to dive a little bit deeper, to share with others. And Nizar shared that the Palestine papers from Al Jazeera have some original documents, or if this is something you're really interested in, his email address is in the chat. And so you're welcome to, I think, reach out directly if you are super interested in this angle or want to learn more or have follow-up questions. So Nizar, go ahead. Sorry, let me unmute you first. There you go.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, because I'm using it on my phone, I can see it. So just to add to Greg's point, it's helpful, especially when you're having these conversations. One, yes, it's the Israelis and Palestinians are not a monolith, right? So different Palestinians have different opinions, and different Israelis have different opinions, right? So start with that first. There is no monolith. All Palestinians want to destroy Israel, right? So that's one. Having said that, it is also important to understand the difference between somebody who's posturing, somebody who's saying something, versus somebody who's actually thinking what to do in practice. Our experience in negotiations has been when we go in second tracks and talk with Palestinians and Israelis, or even Palestinian refugees, right, on what could be the day after, what could it look like, what are things that are very important to you. We found that if they are in front of Israelis, they take these maximalist positions, all the land, all the refugees, all of Jerusalem, what have you. But then when they sit together and actually you do it as an exercise, and they start realizing, okay, they're willing to let me get this in Jerusalem if I give that on refugees, they become way more realistic and way more practical, right? There's a big difference between the negotiation in theory versus negotiation in practice. And that bears itself in the polling itself. You see that the majority of Palestinians and the majority of Israelis believe that a two-state solution is they favor it, but also majorities on both sides believe that the other side is not willing to do that, right? So they distinguish between what they want and what they think is practically possible, right? Which is fair, right? So that's another important thing when you're engaging with people who say, "Oh, the Palestinians don't want this, Palestinians don't want that." It depends on the context. What is at offer on the issue? We can talk more on the refugees. Now, the other important thing is, again, we're all human. It is a fact that Palestinians think it would be so much easier if Israelis are not there, and Israelis think it would be so much easier if the Palestinians are not there. The reality is Palestinians and Israelis, or their leaderships, came to the Oslo Accords not out of a positive investment in peace, but out of a negative recognition of the fact that they failed to extinguish the other. They came together because each side was unable and failed to expel the other completely. So they said, okay, the next best thing is to find some sort of coexistence. So we actually do not have a positive, which is what Greg is alluding to, at least I assume, an actual constructive, positive platform of what does the next day look like, as opposed to what can we give, what's the least worst option, right? So that's another thing to engage people in.
Yeah, very, very mindful of those ideas and those comments. I feel that people may also have questions about other things that are happening in the West Bank, because we have 20 minutes left and we need a positive vision going forward, but also how to speak about some of this stuff. And you and I, as former negotiators, can go down these rabbit holes for quite a while. So all love, no criticism, but I do want to make sure we have space for people to have comments or questions as they need.
Yeah, thanks, Nizar and Greg, for your insight. I'm learning a ton on these calls as well. And I do want to point folks back to the idea of self-interrogation, not just for us personally, but for our communities. Most of us don't have access to, Israeli or Palestinian leadership, or even Israelis and Palestinians. Those aren't the communities many of us come from or where we have access. So I think taking everything we're learning today and thinking about how do we use it in the communities that we come from, where we have access, we can amplify the voices that we care about. We can amplify this message of this is how we got here, not how we get out. Kind of looking through that lens as we continue our conversation too, not just, what is the kind of 10,000-foot picture reality, facts and history, which are incredibly important, but how do we use this in our communities today, where most of us don't have the expertise to dive into that, nor is that always productive with our family and friends. So just bringing that lens back to the conversation as well. Tom, do you have a question that follows up on this? Otherwise, I'm going to jump to someone else.
I have a question about something else, but if you have other people to go to, go ahead.
Okay,
Can I just add one thing? I think this conversation about the history of how we got here is so critical, because this is one of those situations, like most in life, where the facts really do matter and the history really matters and the details matter. And you can tell just by what we've learned from Greg and Nizar today that there's so much of the history that we don't know often. And yet at the same time, to like even to your point, Lynn, and to the point many of us are you know, we're trying to kind of have these conversations. People aren't open to the history, the historical facts as presented, unless they have some ability to see the humanity of sort of both sides in the story. And I think that's where continuing to always both learn that, like go deeper in learning the history and knowing these details and being able to present the facts or alternative experiences of the same history that Israelis and Palestinians have, because often they have a narrative that is shaped by their own experience of a certain set of historical realities rather than a more, you know, larger understanding. But what it often lacks is this ability to see this blindedness to the humanity of the other. And so getting back to those human stories also is part of how we get to a place. And it's not just out of compassion or empathy that we get to that place of seeing the other, but as Greg made a really good, you know, clear point about, like not doing that is how we stay trapped in this. And it's only when we do that that we start to find the way out. But not seeing this as a human story, and understanding the human condition and understanding human needs and how human behavior and all these not understanding all those things is how we get trapped in these things. So I just think that you know, centering on the humanity is the way that we finally can get people to start to listen and be curious about these historical facts that are so central.
It's a great point, Todd. And I'll point us back to our principles and practices of peacemaking, the idea of holding perspectives in tension. That doesn't mean that facts don't matter. They're super important, but it's also important to understand, right, in this case, Israeli perspectives on that history or Palestinian perspectives on that history, or, right, as people were saying, neither of those communities are a monolith. The different perspectives that look at that collective shared reality helps us see the biggest picture possible, both to identify problems, but then also to think about solutions or the type of world we want to build. And so I'm just going to throw that in there too and invite you to go back to our principles and practices as you think about how to engage these conversations with your folks as well. Rebecca, I don't mean to skip over your question, but I think it's about climate change, and none of us are experts on that on this call from Telos. So I'm going to go over that, but I appreciate you raising it. Irina asked a question about why Israel limited the number of trucks that could cross into Gaza, and I'm going to assume you mean humanitarian trucks right now. Greg or Todd, do you want to say something about that quickly?
Well, the stated rationale was for security purposes, and there were instances, obviously, of Palestinian militant organizations using some things that came through the trucks to build mortars and weapons. That's not imagined. However, the restrictions were quite severe, as the impact that we talked about earlier demonstrates. So things like soccer balls, flour, all sorts of things were banned under this dual use provision. So some of those restrictions were a little bit relaxed later on. The larger thing, though, is the dynamic. You know, I give you an analogy here that I think many of our Americans or North Americans on the call will understand around immigration. So at least in the US, a lot of our economy depends upon illegal immigrants or immigrants who did not enter the country legally. We have a lot of rhetoric around it in the public square, but the fact of the matter is that if we want to deal with this problem in a way that is ethical and in a way that the American electorate will sustain, we're depending upon all of this labor and all of these people working in our communities to get us cheap goods and cheap labor and all of these things that we don't want to abandon with if push comes to shove. So I'm not an immigration expert, but there's a very simple analogy here. When we often talk about Gaza these last years, you can look at the Israeli Shin Bet, which is like the CIA. Everyone predicted what would happen about strengthening Hamas and whatnot. So Israel, along with Egypt now, controlled what gets in and out of Gaza through the crossings. But there were these tunnels. Why didn't they shut the tunnels down? Well, guess what? It's a similar issue with, you know, immigration here is if you shut those tunnels down, then you assume all sorts of responsibility for a new reality in the Gaza Strip, which the Israeli public military didn't one to assume. So it was kind of keeping control over Gaza without actually having real control over it. So a lot of those weapons that you saw and that you're seeing come from Gaza now came through those smuggling tunnels that people turned a blind eye to. So there's all sorts of these complex dynamics that we see that we can go down. And as Todd said, it's important to get a sense of that, to understand. What I want to land on, however, with this call is the fact that a lot of this complexity is important for us as we work through the things, but there's some fundamentals at play here. Look, everyone knew that if you sealed 2 million people up, mostly children, in an open air prison, a cage, whatever you want to call it, without any hopes of getting out, nothing good was going to come from that. Period. Nothing good will come from what we're seeing today. We all know that. Does it excuse what Hamas did on October 7th? Absolutely not. Another terrible analogy. Forgive me for being so indelicate, but I think we're all friends on the call. But like, if a child who is abused or, God forbid, sexually abused grows up to abuse and as an adult, does that excuse their behavior? Absolutely not. That is condemnable behavior, and they must be held accountable. Most children who are abused don't grow up to be abusers, but there is a direct correlation between that kind of trauma and what happens in adulthood. So this is not about excusing what Hamas did, but it's also not about excusing what Israel has done either during this period. And furthermore, for us on this call, it's not about excusing how we have engaged. The reality is people often ask where the Palestinian Gandhi is. Well, most Palestinian nonviolent activists are in prison, as you know. But more importantly, where's the Israeli leadership? Where's the Palestinian leadership? The fact of the matter is that we have been key shapers in the reality on the ground of who's in power on the ground. And so the kind of leadership we see on the ground have been supported by our policies and our politics in the West, for good and for bad. So we have weak Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, disastrous Palestinian leadership in the Gaza Strip, disastrous leadership in Israel that we're all sort of kind of rallying around in this moment. And so why I keep coming back to these fundamental points is because we're entering such a period of uncertainty. And the reality as we enter this period of uncertainty is that we need to come back to these principles. We don't know when and how this is going to end. But if we continue doing what we're doing by investing in people that we know to be highly problematic, by divesting in people on the ground and allowing them to have some agency, we're going to continue reconceptualizing, repackaging this unjust reality, which will never lead to security, freedom, dignity for either Israelis or Palestinians. And we have a role in that. Particularly on this call, there are a lot of people connected to communities of faith. It is the so-called Holy Land, and we're entering the Christmas season right now. And one of the massive ironies in the West is that so many of our policies are put forward from people and communities of faith who are organizing, Christians who's teaching. I come from a Christian family, Christian background, like who look nothing like the teachings of Jesus. And so we do have agency and responsibility in this moment. And I would argue even an opportunity to call our friends, our families, our neighbors back to the values that we all say we believe in, and help us figure out how to actually live out those values while holding our leaders to account.
Thanks, Greg. Tom, do you want to bring in your other question now?
No, I talked offline to Todd. I think I'm good. Thanks.
Oh, all the back channel chats that I wish I could hear. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Kind of going off of what Greg was just talking about. In the Christian community that I'm in, I think sometimes people want the well-being of Israelis, but I don't think that there's an understanding of the fact that there are Israelis who want peace for themselves and their Palestinian neighbors. But I also, when I want to bring that to the table, don't want to give the impression that that's like an overwhelming majority, or like make light of the fact that they're not necessarily the ones who have the military power and who have the power to do what's happening in Gaza right now. So how can I discuss that and bring it to the light and highlight those Israeli voices, Israeli Jewish voices, I would say, probably more specifically, in a balanced way?
Yeah, it's a super important question, Madeline. Thank you. What comes to mind for me first is the power of story, that people remember stories long after they forget about conversations just about facts or history or political opinions. And I think especially in this moment where we're seeing silencing of those exact, Jewish, Israeli, or Palestinian citizen of Israeli peacemakers who care about mutual flourishing and are living it out already, that right now is an incredibly important time for us to be amplifying their stories. And I know it's so hard not to say, well, this isn't everyone, or this is just a small minority voice, but where I kind of land with that when I share those stories too is people hear the mainstream narratives much louder than they hear those stories of peacemakers and radical peacemakers. And so I'm not worried that they're going to over assume that too many people are believing this way, but you never know, right? How those seeds that you plant now telling those stories kind of continue working to counteract that idea, well, no one wants peace. So definitely, hard when we think about who has political power and all of that, but encouraging folks to follow those voices directly, I think is really powerful too, especially if they're on social media or put out public content. The more that comes not just from you, but from those folks themselves, it starts to feel like there are more people. And I think that feeling that we are not alone in this, or that we aren't an insubstantial, ineffective minority, is huge for making people want to buy in and be part of a movement that they feel is growing. And so kind of casting it through that lens of this is out there, this is possible, you're invited to join, even if we don't have power yet, invites people into that work in a way that is realistic, but oriented towards growth, rather than kind of framing it through but this will never work pessimism that I also know is out there and sometimes comes in those responses. Any other questions or responses from the Telos team in the last few minutes we have together?
I just want to throw out that, and I know I don't speak alone for the people on this call, that we hold everybody on Telos in our prayers. You've been involved, some more intimate than others, but obviously the people that are being infected by this in the Gaza Strip, we're praying for, but also we understand the weightiness of this on your team. So I appreciate everybody taking this time.
Thanks, Tom. We appreciate that. I mean, we appreciate all of you for continuing to show up. We do what we do because we want to transform communities at home and in Israel, Palestine, and we can't do that without you all being the ones on the front lines in your communities, your families, with your friends doing this work. And so it's incredibly encouraging to us that you all are bought in. You're doing this work in real time. You're continuing to lean and engage and not turn away, and to recognize the ways that we have implication, but we also have agency. I'm going to put in the chat again our resources we have for contacting your members of Congress to call for a ceasefire. Our calls are working. It might not feel like we are seeing things as fast as we want, but we're seeing shifts in Congress, even if they're incremental. And so for you all, continue doing the work you're doing, reaching out to elected officials, but also to friends and family, engaging where you see this. None of us today know how much of an impact that does or doesn't have, but we know, quote unquote, the day after that this work will continue. And so everything we're doing now feeds into what we will continue doing then. And so, yeah, just really want to amplify and highlight that your agency also really matters. And none of the work we could do would have any impact without your partnership and you doing this work with us.
I also would love to thank Sarah and Karam and MJ for doing such an incredible job. We were just talking earlier. Telos was not set up to be a communications organization, as you know, and we're building this new functionality out in real time that a lot of us, some of us, but like Karam, have some expertise in, and MJ, but we're really learning how to do this in real time. And Dave Davis on the call as well has been really coordinating us. So thank you there. And I do want to just share one thought, just take it a little bit deeper. What Sarah just said. These times feel really dark, but the voices that we represent on this call have incredible power right now. And it may not feel like that, but every conversation, everywhere that you speak up has impact. People are listening. The conversation is changing. It will continue to change. We're going into Advent. Some Palestinian Christians are coming to DC next week. But what I want to say is just highlight the fact that when North Americans have outsized impact on the ground, it's not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are multiple parties. That includes multiple parties in the Middle East, but it also includes us. We're on the ground there. We've incorporated this into our communities as well. And the more people who come from skeptical backgrounds, who they may not be, they may lean very heavily pro-Israel or very, pro-Palestine in some sense, but who recognize that this is an opportunity to act wisely. And what that means is that we need to have a call for ceasefire, release of all hostages immediately. This is an opportunity that we have. Biden is playing electoral politics right now. He presumes that progressives are going to be in his camp. And he's playing towards this, persuadable middle, which often includes a lot of non-denominational Christians in it, who he presumes are pro-Israel. Yet we know that the demographics shifts are showing a very different picture. So our voices have real power right now to speak up and to shape this conversation. What I wanted to say about ceasefire, just to offer a few comments there, is one, ceasefire is not the end, it's the next step. Remember, response to 9/11, it took months, even a year, to formulate, the Iraq War, more than a year, to make these consequential mistakes. This took hours. Somehow in the space of hours, everything was targeted, and we knew exactly where Hamas was and like how to target Hamas. That does not pass the straight face test. So this is something that is making us weaker, not stronger. It's making people less secure, not more secure. And more importantly, right now, ceasefire is not about taking sides on Israel-Palestine. Ceasefire is not about a just peace in Israel-Palestine. It's not going to bring all the hostages home. It's not going to do all of these big things that we all want it to do. It's not going to dismantle Hamas. Got news for you. What's happening now is not going to do that either, right? But the point being that we need to take a step back from the brink before this spreads to Jerusalem, the rest of the West Bank, the region, and the world. Ceasefire is an opportunity to take a breath, to stop untold atrocities in real time, and just as important, to prevent this from metastasizing and growing into something truly uncontrollable. The more we can make that argument, the more we can have people who come from backgrounds who don't necessarily see the world the way we do, but who understand that, wow, we really don't want this to go to massive regional or global war, the better. And we have that opportunity. We have that power in this moment.
Lisa, I don't want to skip your question, but we are at time, and I want to land us in a place of the difference between optimism and pessimism and hope and despair, which is something our colleague David brings to the table and talks about a lot. If we think about the difference between optimism and pessimism, I think in this moment, a lot of us are not feeling very optimistic about tomorrow or the week after. And it's okay to feel pessimism, but the difference between hope and despair in some ways is much more important. If we think about what our partner Mitri Raheb says, hope is what you do, then despair is deciding that nothing you do can have any impact. And so in this moment, I would invite you to fall wherever you fall on the optimism versus pessimism scale, but to remember that it's so important to act in hope and not give into the despair that change is never going to happen, or it's only going to get worse, or it isn't possible. Because as Greg was just saying, this could get worse, but we also know it could get better, right? Change is possible. It's always possible, for better or worse. And so when we act in hope, we act knowing that pessimistically it might not happen tomorrow, but it's still the right thing to do, even when it feels impossible. And so I'm going to land us on that note for today. This is a big, heavy conversation. So go home and digest. My inbox is always open if there are follow-up questions. Over the next few weeks, we'll continue to invite partners and try and elevate voices from the ground directly as they feel safe and secure and able to do so. Otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in today. Continue to advocate and elevate voices where you have access, and we appreciate your presence so much. Take care.